Well, thank you very much indeed for that very generous introduction, Richard, and thank you all for coming to hear me. When it was suggested that I might address you all today, it occurred to me that although I've been a friend of the Bodleian since about 1986, I've never addressed the Friends in person. I've done it once in the pandemic online, but never with you all here in the flesh, as it were. So it's a great pleasure to be able to do that. And as Richard says, I'm going to be talking to you about appropriately enough, here in the Bodleian for the Friends of this organisation, the place of libraries and the role of libraries in society, and particularly thinking about the defence of knowledge and thinking about the social importance of preserving knowledge. And that's really the theme of Burning the Books. But what I'm going to talk to you today has a particular Bodleian slant on it, which I hope you'll indulge me for the next 45 minutes or so, but also trying to bring the topic that I addressed in the book, which was published in 2020, a little more up to date with some of the things that have been happening in this space more recently. And I think sort of as we think about libraries, and particularly as we think about them here in Oxford at the Bodleian, it's so easy to be drawn into almost a kind of a dreamlike world to me. You know, the Bodleian was a dream of mine coming to work here when I was a librarian all those years ago in Durham and London and Edinburgh. And to be here, I took a couple of photographs just walking around early one morning the other week. And it is an extraordinary place. You know, it's so easy to fall in love with it. You know, the architecture that the library occupies, the place in the hearts of people in the university and in the scholarly community more broadly, the collections that we have, the colleagues that we have, the history that we have. And I've been lucky enough to be part of that history. The refurbishment of this building, of course, was one I was particularly closely associated with. And I think that you know, the place of the Bodleian is very special. It is sui generis in the library world. But so many libraries also have that their own particular communities to whom they mean so much, or their particular histories, which are all very, very interesting. And I really enjoyed the exhibition that we had actually during the pandemic on Robert Burton's Anatomy of Melancholy, which I don't know, it wasn't open for very long. We had to close it. But there was this one phrase that Burton cites from a Renaissance philosopher that really kind of struck me. You know, that idea of a library is the physic of the soul. And I also got to know the Argentinian writer and librarian Alberto Manguel, and he, of course, is the great disciple, acolyte of Borges. And one thinks of Borges and you think of these great ideas of a library, the ideal library having all of knowledge contained within it. And that's, you know, makes for extravagant happiness, doesn't it? Well, it does in my house, except for the books that I don't have, which don't engender happiness, just want. But I think as we walk around the libraries in Oxford, not just the Bodleian, but all the other libraries, and we enjoy their riches, the collections, and interact with the wonderful skill and commitment of my colleagues that are librarians, we have to remember that libraries have been hard fought. There's been a history going back millennia that has had shown how libraries have been attacked, have been fragile, have been vulnerable. And what I really want to say to you today is that continues. That fragility, that vulnerability, that sense of them being places which are under attack continues. And, you know, on that cautionary theme, I've written recently about public libraries in particular. You know, we've seen a great decline in the number of public libraries. A number of them have been closed. The austerity crisis has hit them particularly hard in this country. And even those that remain, their opening hours have been severely reduced. And the kind of the national statistics around public libraries are incredibly sobering. And I really think that the time has come for government to take them very seriously. But libraries are under attack in different ways. Those of us who have used or rely on the British Library, of course, are still suffering from the cyber attack, which kind of rendered it almost, almost silent as a library service back in 2023, and it is far from fully recovered. Across the pond in America, we've seen many public institutions, including the National Archives of the United States and the Library of Congress, come under severe political pressure, with the Librarian of Congress and indeed the Archivist of the United States both removed from office without cause by the current regime. And really their stance for their institutions as being kind of democratic institutions for the people promoting particular policy points was really what brought them to the point of removal of office. And we also see an epidemic of book banning in school and public libraries across America, and that is beginning to be seen in again across the Atlantic in this country and in the Republic of Ireland as well, as what people are they able to read, what books are stocked, what services are provided in school and public libraries in America have become a point of pretty severe political contention. And then we have technology. We have organizations like Google and others that have moved into, if you like, the domain of knowledge and have sought to put, wrap it in commercial priorities and to monetize the interaction with knowledge that we use on those platforms. And this provides a challenge for libraries, how to engage with the world of the big tech companies, what our colleague here in Oxford, Timothy Garton-Ash, calls private superpowers. And in my book, I liken them to the Roman Catholic Church in the Middle Ages. They have enormous wealth, they operate across political boundaries, and they can look into your soul. But libraries have this extraordinary history, and we know so much about the libraries of the ancient world now, thanks to scholarship, particularly classical scholarship and archaeology. We know the first libraries that exist, that we know to have existed in the civilizations of Mesopotamia, and extraordinary amounts of detail from excavations and the number of books in the form of clay tablets that survive, and that we've been able to kind of determine the operation of librarians, who of course were priests in temples. It's not gone unnoticed among my library colleagues here in the Bodleian, our priestly role. And libraries in the ancient world began to become major institutions. Of course, the most famous of them all, this is the library at Celsus and Ephesus. It was the ancient library, the Great Library of Alexandria, and we have a sort of tiny connection to it, if you like. Bear with me on this one, but we have the oldest surviving manuscript of Euclid's Elements of Geometry, written in the Imperial Academy in Byzantium in the 9th century. But Euclid, of course, wrote this text in the Great Library of Alexandria with the access to all of that knowledge. Libraries in the ancient world, we have a few survivals from a great library from the Roman Empire, from Herculaneum, scrolls in a private library known as the Villa of the Papyri in Herculaneum, fused in the eruption of Vesuvius in AD 79. And after the end of the classical period, libraries continued to preserve knowledge. They were much smaller. They treasured their collections and they copied them. And this was, an absolutely vital role for libraries to enable scribes to copy texts and to circulate them. And that was true both in the Christian West and in the Muslim world. And libraries continue to evolve. This is a couple of photographs I took during the period when we were collaborating with the Vatican Library over a large digitization project. And this is the old door of the Library of Sixtus V. And you can see that preservation was very important to them. If you just look at the spikes, the iron spikes on that door, this was not the welcome everyone in to our library attitude that we're familiar with today. If you go to the public libraries, this was a kind of keep out unless you're really serious about coming in. And here in Oxford, we have this, very, very long tradition of keeping knowledge. The room, the first floor room there, you can see the window, was the site of the first university library, built after a gift of books made in 1320 by the Bishop of Worcester, and then subject to some dispute over both the books and the money with Oriel College, but then eventually populated with the university's corporately owned collection, which was transformed in the 15th century, of course, when Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, made his gift of books to the university in the 1430s and 1440s. And the library moved them from the church to the site where we're all familiar with it now as Duke Humphrey's Library. But of course, that library was subject to the ravages of the commissioners of Edward VI in the most virulent phase of the Protestant Reformation, and most of the collections there were dispersed. We only know of about, I think, 11 books, and only a handful of them now here in Oxford in the Bodleian. And one of them recovered thanks to the help of the Friends of the Bodleian just 2 years ago, a stray from Duke Humphrey's Library, thought lost, but now hit back here again. And I think that sort of sense of the vulnerability, the fragility of knowledge, which Oxford saw at close quarters during the 16th century. There was that phrase that in Oxford books were dog cheap and whole libraries could be had for an inconsiderable nothing. That caused a reaction, and that reaction was created by Sir Thomas Bodley himself. And that sense that he would do something to make the library of his university less fragile, to put efforts in place to preserve it. And that meant for him both a rebuilding project that we know as the Schools Quadrangle and, the old Bodleian, but it also meant new shelves in the library, stocking it with books anew, thinking about preservation. The statutes of the library that he founded had an emphasis on preservation, on keeping the collections. And that was because he had witnessed that vulnerability. He'd grown up during that turmoil. He was born in 1547. So the kind of if you like, the smoke of the fires of the Reformation were in his nostrils as a child. So that investment that he made was not just in the structure of the library, in the books, but also in the endowment. And he recognized that it was possible to attack the library in the 16th century because, as he said, it lacked a standing rent for officers' stipends, for the augmentation of books, and for what he called other pertinent occasions. And he then endowed the library, and he endowed the post of librarian. This is my predecessor, Thomas James, who really suffered from having his major benefactor still alive and breathing down his neck and very concerned about every tiny detail of what he was doing to the library that Sir Thomas was so invested in. And that sense of, both the collaboration between funder and first librarian, first director, if you like, created a very positive tension and a moment of incredible innovation. The fact that what we call legal deposit, or the copyright privilege that we still rely on today, 1,000 new books come to this library every day thanks to that privilege. That began with a very clever idea that Sir Thomas Bodley had, and he and James put it to the company of stationers, and they fell for it, ladies and gentlemen. And that's meant, essentially free books ever since. Hooray. But also, James was as concerned as his founder to ensure that the collections of the library will be well looked after. And so that sense of the arrangements for preservation, whether it was chaining the books so that they wouldn't walk, whether it was ensuring that the statutes that all of the users of the library signed up to would be adhered to, or ensuring that the library was staffed appropriately to look after it. Of course, the first position in the library actually wasn't Bodley's librarian, but Bodley's janitor, what we now call the chief operating officer. And so that sense of defending knowledge was absolutely present. But that also meant acquiring books, the augmentation of books, as Bodley put it. And these are just some examples of those collections that came into the library at the foundation or in the early years afterwards. And so these were the sense that the Bodleian was not just a local library, was not just the library for the university, but had its remit to be global, or as global as they understood it at the time. So acquiring a major famous collection of Greek manuscripts under the nose of the Pope, there were kind of religious tensions, of course, as well. But acquiring knowledge so that they could be preserved, but preservation for access always. And this became part of, if you like, the policy landscape for libraries, if I can put it in those modern terms. So the writers on libraries, the library theorists like Gabriel Naudet, felt that there was a role that libraries played for their communities, for citizens, and that was about education, fundamentally, about giving access to knowledge and as much knowledge as possible. And Naudet praised the Bodleian in his book just a couple of decades after the library opened. He recognised it as only one of essentially 3 libraries in Europe that were accessible to the public. Not the public as we would understand it today, but to a much broader range of users than just private libraries for small communities like universities. And this idea of encompassing wide-ranging knowledge and preserving that for access, again, you find the philosopher Gottfried Leibniz, who was, we think of him now as a great philosopher, logician, but he was a librarian and wrote great works of library and archive theory. So all of this sort of background movement during the Renaissance enabled the Bodleian to come into being, enabled Sir Thomas Bodley's great idea of a kind of machine of learning, both preserving and making knowledge accessible. And this is, of course, from Logan's great work on Oxford, published in the 1670s. But we also must remember that even though there was this great moment of innovation, great investment in the buildings, collections moving into the library, that sense of fragility was just very, very close. And you see that in another, if you like, defender of knowledge. It wasn't just the librarians, but others in powerful positions recognized that the fragility of knowledge and the importance of its preservation. Here's Fairfax, here's the Cromwell's general, the New Model Army, here's the man who besieged Oxford, but here's also the man who posted his own troops as a guard on the library so that Cromwell's forces wouldn't ransack it and destroy it. He feared that the knowledge kept in the library would be subject to destruction once again at the end of the siege of Oxford. But Fairfax also gave his own a collection of manuscripts to the library, as did Cromwell. So they recognised, even though, of course, Oxford had been the royalist centre during the Civil War, and my predecessor, the second librarian, had loaned the king the library's endowment to help him fight the Civil War. Not a particularly good investment, as it turns out. And we recorded it as a debt in our annual accounts until 1798, when we kind of gave up. I have worked out that it would be £31 million in today's money, so if someone would like to write to the present king, I'd be happy if that debt was repaid. But we see the kind of sense of libraries during the Enlightenment period, during the 18th century, also kind of expand. And that idea of public accessibility of libraries, even though the notion of the public was very different in the 17th century, as the 18th century moved forward, that idea of the public became broader and more encompassing. And we see it in the act that established the British Museum, which of course had then at its heart a library. The library function was fundamentally important to an element of the British Museum, that the collection of the library be preserved and maintained, not only for the inspection and entertainment of the learned and the curious, but for the general use and benefit of the public. So that sense that the public had a right to access knowledge that was held by the nation, and a right that it be both preserved and maintained, but also available for a broader community. And of course, we some of us in the audience remember working in this room. I was interested to see some promotional material from the British Museum today, recently, I think just recently as last week, and thinking how good it would be to have reading going on in that reading room again. And I'd also like to call out one of my predecessors. Actually, I forget his number as Bodley's librarian. I'll be honest, I just like his name, Bulkley Bandinel, who couldn't enjoy hearing, but he was the longest serving Bodley's librarian. I think there are 41 years he served. I've got a long way to go yet. But he was responsible for extraordinary collection acquisition. He was during his reign, of course, he became Bodley's librarian in 1813, and that period saw the accessibility of collections that had been secularized during the Napoleonic era, and incredible collections came onto the market, and Bulkley Bandinel went for it, ladies and gentlemen, and we had extraordinary collections like the Canonici collection, great collection of Italian medieval manuscripts come into the library. But we also saw during the 18th century and 19th century a great expansion of the role that libraries had in circulating ideas and making knowledge accessible. We have circulating libraries, subscription libraries, even miners' libraries and other forms of library giving access to knowledge to broader areas of society, lower down the social order than had access to libraries before. An incredible moment that then led up to the Public Libraries Act of 1850. Last year we celebrated 175 years of the Public Libraries Act, an incredible moment, I think, in this society, and one which almost went unnoticed in the broader public. And we claim here in Oxford to have one of our own, Edward Edwards, who was not only the individual who pushed for the establishment of the Act, he was the person who gave the most evidence during the report stage as the bill went through Parliament, and then became the first librarian of the first library to be established after the Act was published in Manchester. The Manchester Free Library opened in 1853. They were able to do that because the Act gave local authorities the right to raise a halfpenny on the rates to fund a free public library. And that's what they did in Manchester. Edward Edwards became the first librarian. And then after, I think, almost 20 years there, he came to Oxford, first as the librarian of the Queen's College, and then latterly employed here in the Bodleian cataloguing manuscripts. But I was very interested to read, and we've ended up with some of Edward Edwards' pamphlet collections around the 1850 Acts, both before, during and after. And it's very interesting reading some of those because it gave a great insight into the motivation of the people of Manchester. So they were able to use the rates to pay for the library service, but funding the building was something that the local community had to raise themselves. But they did it. And the purpose of the library was extraordinary, I think. Increased and wholly gratuitous facilities for the diffusion of knowledge and for the mental culture among all classes. I think, that's something which I think still resounds, at least to me today, that idea that libraries can improve the mental well-being, the mental landscape of all people. And we must pay tribute here too to great innovators, as the first of my predecessors to be a professional librarian was Edward Nicholson, E.B. Nicholson. We still have the Nicholson classification system. We have lots of elements of the professionalisation of the way the library was run, thanks to Nicholson, who was also one of the founders of the Library Association, the formal organisation that represents library professionals. And any of you in the audience who went to library school will, like me, have had Ranganathan's 5 laws of library science drilled into them there. And the 5th law is that the library is a growing organism. And that sort of sense of change and innovation is one that this library has been extraordinarily part of. In the 20th century, a very bold organic step taken by my predecessor Edmund Craster was to take in the enormous collection of ephemera formed by John Johnson, who's the printer to the university. It's so big we've never properly counted it. When it came to the library, it was at least 1 million items. So the press were really keen to get shot of it because they wanted office space back. And this posed an incredible burden on the library, but they saw the opportunity. They saw the need to preserve one man's passion in collecting the bits of paper that most normal people will have thrown away. But thank goodness John Johnson didn't, because all sorts of things like posters, trade catalogues, menus, theatre ephemera were kept from the 15th century to the 20th, and they're now heavily used by scholars. One of my predecessors made the bold step to look after the archive of Franz Kafka. I hope some of you came to see our exhibition marking the centenary of Franz Kafka's death. But that act was a bold one in the middle of the Cold War. A Czech writer whose works would, if they had ended up back in communist Czechoslovakia, would undoubtedly have been destroyed, as they were actually some parts of it by the Nazis in World War II. So that sense of continuing to grow, continuing to develop, is certainly one that I've inherited from my predecessors, and I'd like to especially pay tribute to my three immediate predecessors, David Vasey, Sarah Thomas, and Reg Carr. And I'd like to pay tribute to some of the things that they've done to both defend knowledge and to make it accessible. Things like digitization. Both David and Reg and Sarah were very early adopters of the phases of new technology, both digitization, making things like medieval manuscripts available across the globe in high resolution. In the days I remember going onto this site when I was at Edinburgh, and the files were so large and the internet was so slow that I could go and make a cup of coffee by the time a page had downloaded. But now it seems incredibly innovative. Looking back, that was a kind of a bold step to take, a risk that was taken, but also one which brought college libraries and the Bodleian together to create a resource that helped scholars. Ever since the libraries existed, we've never had enough space for books. And that's something, if you think of the growth of the old library, Christopher Wren having to put buttresses in the early 18th century on the walls of the library because there were so many books, it was pushing them out. You think of Edward Nicholson and William Gladstone working out the first mobile shelving, but then you think of Sarah Thomas's idea to create a Harvard-style high bay, high density, highly efficient repository like the one that we have at Swindon. Now has 14 million collection items there and an incredibly efficient delivery service. And then in this building, underneath where we sit, is climate-controlled, fire-safe stacks for our rare books and manuscripts. But the equivalent of those in the digital world, as our digital collections have grown exponentially, is something, again, which the library, my colleagues, have put great emphasis on and proved to be highly skillful at. This is our digital preservation microservices, constantly scanning the storage that we have for our digital collections, constantly monitoring the integrity of those digital objects which are stored there, alerting us when we need to migrate certain types of content from one operating system to another, and so on. But also working together across the library world. So the UK Web Archive has been an extension of our copyright privilege that goes back to the days of Thomas Bodley and Thomas James in 1610. But today means that we have both the legal right, but also the legal responsibility to archive the whole of the UK web domain. And that means that's really too big a task for each of the 6 copyright libraries to do individually. So we collaborate, we work together, we co-fund and co-organise a team that harvests the whole of the UK web domain once a year, an extraordinary task. And we've also been working with our historic friends and rivals in Cambridge to work together, to pool our resources, to pool our expertise on this ever-growing task of digital preservation. But at the heart of the library is still the space, the physical space of the library. And I chose the RAGCAM partly because I suspect that many of you have sat there for many hours in the past and perhaps still today. But also today, this is our most beloved reading room by our students. And even in the age where most of our reading resources are available digitally to our students and scholars 24/7, wherever they might be, and often on these things, it's slightly counterintuitive to think that if you go into the RAGCAM during term, it'll be full by about 10 o'clock. There are 460 seats there. And even though those the readers there have got their noise cancelling headphones on, they've got their laptops open, being in a space that inspires concentration and learning, and being around other people who are concentrating hard is something that motivates people to learn. And we really realised this was really brought home to us during the pandemic, when of course students and researchers couldn't come into the physical library. And we heard from them volubly how much they missed it, how much they wanted it. And so much so that one of my brilliant colleagues, unbeknownst to me, had recorded the background sound of 4 of our reading rooms. And during the pandemic, these were streamed online, so that if you were sat in your bedroom in Winchelsea or Wigan or wherever it was, you could play the background sounds, the coughs and splutters and dropped books and pens comfortingly in the background, and hundreds of thousands of people downloaded those files and streamed them during the pandemic. You can still find them on YouTube, by the way. I want to finish my talk today by presenting you with my sense of what the value of libraries are today. What is the purpose of a library? What are the functions of a library? And I would like to posit 5 of those to you. And the first of those is probably the most obvious one of all, and that is education. They are engines for education. And that here in Oxford today, for the Bodleian, that means online journals, electronic books, databases, those kinds of things. They are downloaded. Our electronic journal collection was downloaded nearly 20 million times last year. So extraordinary uses. That's educating students and researchers in all sorts of ways. But libraries have done this kind of fundamental task for a very long time. I was really struck reading a blog post from the British Library a few years ago by Sylvia which found Sylvia Pankhurst's letter of application for a reader's ticket at the British Museum. And that idea that that information held in the library would create, would underpin the extraordinary social change that extending suffrage to women would bring about, was partly because of the access to knowledge, that educational function of libraries. And that sense that libraries, going back to the British Museum founding statutes in the 18th century, are available to all, that they equalise access to information across all classes, is, I think, of fundamental importance. But also the idea that libraries are part of broader, monumental intellectual enterprises like the Oxford English Dictionary. So the team of the Oxford English Dictionary actually occupied what is now the History of Science Museum in the late 19th and early 20th century. And they chose their office there because they wanted to be as close as possible to the Bodleian. They couldn't be in it, but they could be as close as possible to that. And that educational function today we interpret, again, very much more broadly. So using scientific techniques to extract new kinds of knowledge from artifacts that we may have had for centuries, like the wonderful project Archeox that we have at the moment, which has revealed the doodles and annotations of an 8th century nun in Kent, my home county. And her name, Eadburg, she's known in the archival record to have existed, but she wrote her name in the margins of one of our manuscripts, invisible to the naked eye and only made possible through technology. But you also see how important libraries are for education when they are taken away from people. And I wrote an article in 2021 about the impact of the Taliban's return to power on libraries that have been established for educating women and young girls in Afghanistan. Just a handful of them, not many of them, very humble, simple libraries that were the first things to be destroyed by the Taliban as they took over. And I've also been thinking a lot about the idea of access to knowledge and democracy and that educational function which political theorists like John Stuart Mill, or in this case John Rawls, have really strongly identified, that link between an educated citizenry being essential for a healthy democracy. You have to have educated citizens in order to engage with the infrastructure of democracy. And libraries and also kind of archives are places where, for my second function, where the rights of citizens are preserved and can be accessed. So this is actually one of the archives of the Stasi in Berlin. And it was really struck me that after 1989, Berliners, people in East Germany, took over Stasi headquarters to stop the Stasi from destroying the files that showed their surveillance culture. And they demanded access. They wanted to have an entire separate legal entity was created to enable German citizens to have access to their own files. But you can't have a healthy democracy unless the laws of the land are accessible to its citizens. And law libraries like our own that have not just legal documentation from this country, but legal documentation from the European Union, are places where citizens can go to access that legal information. And as we find that the regimes of knowledge have changed as the digital world has come into play over the last 40 years or so, we find that libraries, this is in the Beinecke Library in Yale, have sort of almost morgues of defunct technology, because there are still collections where old kinds of floppy disks and digital tapes contain knowledge that deserve to be preserved and protected. But also, and I've written about this a couple of times in the past, as we see how politicians and civil servants and other people in governments have used encrypted technologies like WhatsApp in order to basically develop public policy. Particularly we saw it during the pandemic, that the rights of our citizens to have access to that information. How was the pandemic managed, for example? Well, the WhatsApp messages of Boris Johnson and his inability to share them in a timely fashion was really what brought his government down. And really what I have been saying is that these should be brought under the scope of our National Archives legislation, the Public Records Act. And in an age of disinformation and misinformation, libraries are a source of facts and truth, where you can be sure that knowledge has its kind of foundations. It can be accessed, that role of citation, of being able to verify your findings. That's where libraries, both in their physical and in their digital form, have a particular role to play, I think. And again, I always try to draw from the well of the Bodleians' history, and this quote from the famous pedant A.E. Housman always enlivens me. He'd found an error in a footnote in a German scholar's edition of Horace, which had missed a variant reading only found in one of the manuscripts here in the Bodleian, which he deemed to be the arsenals of Nemesis. But of course, we have to go back to the president of Magdalen, Martin Rauff, in the 19th century, to, I think encapsulated beautifully the importance of citation and being able to access reliable knowledge. I think, sir, he was asked, what advice, Dr. Rauff, would you give to a young scholar? I think, said the old man, since you care for the advice of an old man, sir, you will find it a very good practice always to verify your references, sir. And what does that mean to us in a library like this today? Well, of course, it means maintaining those books and documents on the shelves so that anybody can come in and check them. But it also means the regime of citation, and not just shelf marks that might be put in erudite articles by German scholars of Horace, but in this day, DOIs, persistent identifiers, URLs, ARCs, all of those kind of regimes of digital citation and referential infrastructure. And I want to invoke George Orwell here, because if we're unable to provide fixed, reliable access to information, unless we're able to preserve the truth, it allows, as we see increasingly, lies to creep in their place. My fourth function of a library is a source of identity of society, and we really saw that in the Holocaust. This, of course, was the scene on Unter den Linden in the heart of Berlin on the 10th of May 1933, as German students heaped books from neighbouring libraries and bookshops and poured petrol on them. And we saw whole communities, not only were they murdered in Central and Eastern Europe, but their libraries were destroyed at the same time. And we see this happening again in the Ukraine, that idea of identity, of library collections being an important part of the identity of communities and society, where in Russian-occupied Ukraine, Russian troops are taking books in Ukrainian out and burning them in the street. And again, I've written about that in the Atlantic. But I think the idea of adaptability, this idea of libraries as growing organisms, are taken somewhat to the extreme by our colleagues in Ukraine, where they're turning their basement library stacks into bomb shelters, where people sheltering from Russian drones and shells can actually do some reading at the same time. Finally, I'd like to suggest to you that libraries are a place where a diversity of knowledge can be encountered. And that means not just a diversity of languages, and we have plenty of examples of that in our library system here, but a diversity of opinion. And again, if you think of Mill, you think of Rawls, and you think of bringing different ideas to place, to interplay, where you can access them safely in libraries. And this, again, this idea, this core idea, is being attacked, particularly in America, in school and public libraries in many states at the moment. And where the library community is organising in order to defend them. And this is a kind of Victorian imagining of the burning of the Great Library of Alexandria, which of course we now know didn't actually take place. But the idea of the vulnerability of knowledge and the commitment of librarians over millennia to preserve it, I think, and these are just my final words, I take great inspiration from the story about one book here in the library. And this was a book presented to us by the poet Milton, who was great friends with my predecessor, the second librarian, and a volume of his works was presented to the library, and Milton wrote a poem in praise of the Bodleian. and presented it to the library. And of course, Milton, as one of the signatories to the death warrant of Charles I, after the Restoration, his works were definitely not encouraged by the Restoration monarchy. In fact, they were ordered to be burned on a number of occasions alongside the works of other regicides, actually burned in Oxford in the library quadrangle, in the school's quadrangle. But this time, my predecessor, the fifth librarian, Thomas Hyde, took great pains to secrete that famous book, hiding it, refusing to give it up, even falsifying the entry in the library catalogue to say that it had already been removed. And we still have that book today. And Hyde must have taken some risk himself to protect that particular item of knowledge. And that sense that libraries are long-standing institutions, they are enduring institutions, they are institutions that society can rely on. This is the first book that the library received under the deposit privilege back in 1611. You can still read that today. It's intact and available to you. So I would like to leave you, ladies and gentlemen, with the idea that libraries are the infrastructure of democracy. They're not alone in that, but they are a particular part, I think, of the infrastructure of an open democratic society. And that role that libraries play in defending knowledge is one that ultimately is in defence of that open democratic society. Thank you very much indeed for listening.